So funny when that happens. And today we're going to discuss, as I mentioned just a little bit ago, some of the COVID specific questions on the core COVES instrument. And then right around the half hour, we're going to segue to ideas that you all might have about sharing our data. And that's a very open-ended conversation we're going to have. So before we get too far, I am going to screen share the document that Alex so helpfully provided in the invitation for this.
You want to screen share? I could also.
Oh, if you could screen share, that would be great. My brain.
Yeah, I can screen share. I have it up already.
Wonderful. And Sarah posted it in the chat.
There's so many ways to view this document.
So many cool. So the Google Doc that Alex is about to share, again, these are the modifications that we made in response to the COVID pandemic. So again, this is not all of the questions that are on the core survey. Those of you who are currently collecting data know that. Those of you who are set to reopen know that if you've reviewed your instrument. But these are the changes that we made. So questions 1 through 6 represent additions to the core that we have added. And questions 7 and 8 represent changes we made specifically to the income question. The savvy ones among you.
Number 1 is kind of a modification to the question. So
yes,
just a slight adjustment.
Right. Thank you for pointing that out, Alex. So this is very large font, which is great for all of us. You can also access the Google Doc yourselves in the chat, thanks to Sarah's helpful hyperlink. And the savvy ones among you will know or will remember that we also changed the last visit response options last year because of all the museum closures. It said something like, you know, sometime in 2020 before the pandemic, sometime in 2020 after we reopened, sometime in 2019 or before. We have since changed because entering 2021, those response options didn't make sense. So it's exactly the way it was pre-pandemic. And we want to have a conversation today around what makes the most sense, how people are using the data, what we need to do to be flexible for all of you, knowing that our schedules are quite different across organizations, but that we do have some value in keeping things the same depending on how people are using the data. So before we get too far, does anyone have any questions about these COVID questions, the changes we've made, the response options, anything like that? Okay, Alex, maybe stop screen sharing, and if people need to refer back to this, they can use their own hyperlink.
Holly, did you have something? I saw you come off mute.
Yeah, I was sorry, I'm in the mask. We've got summer camps going on. Mine is more of like looking ahead and thinking about like how we use the data. And to be quite honest, it's the free response data that is the most useful to us right now, and in terms of taking the pulse of our visitors about health and safety. And one of the things that I'm wondering about is that, you know, the touching stuff is less of a problem, and we know that scientifically too. And what I'm starting to see show up is questions about masks, and especially as our mask mandate has been lifted, as we've stopped enforcing because we've been told to, and that by the university, I should say, this is not an internal to the museum thing, and concerns particularly about kids. And I'm just wondering, you know, that's showing up in those free response questions. And so I'm kind of, for now, for me, like that works. Like, I don't think there has to be a specific question about the mask stuff. And I think things are so variable from institution to institution that I don't know if there is a one single question, but I just wanted to throw that out there because the touching stuff is less useful to me now as we're looking for changes moving forward. And it's more about the pulse of our visitors and how safe or unsafe they feel.
Wonderful. Thanks for sharing that. Except you jumped ahead. I have all these poll questions.
Oh, sorry. I was so excited by like thinking about it. I was like, and we just had a cross-functional team meeting today, so we were talking about some of these things.
No, that's actually, that helps set the stage beautifully, Holly. So thank you so much for saying that. And we're going to get a chance to talk exactly about what you just said, because we really want to hear from you. I'm going to touch on the first thing you mentioned, Holly, which is the data you're using. So the 2 poll questions that I'm going to launch right now really ask about both of those things that Holly just mentioned. I will read them out loud. How have you used these data? And this is a select all that apply. unless you choose the first option, which is I haven't. There are a couple response options for general reporting, comparing yourselves over time, i.e. internal tracking, comparing yourselves to others, simple reporting to external stakeholders. So maybe that's for your public audiences or for public policy advocacy. Or you can say another option and then put something in the chat if you're using the data in other ways. So again, how are you using the data that were specific to the document Alex showed, the COVID responsive data? The second question, once you get there, is about the health and safety thing. So Holly just mentioned some of the guidance either put out by the state or the university because they're attached to a U. And what, if anything, is your museum currently doing to promote health and safety for visitors as a result of the pandemic? We know this is all over the place depending on where you are geographically. So we're very curious about your institution, your location, and what you are doing. And so I'm going to stop talking and leave this up for just another 30 seconds or so you can respond in peace and quiet.
Mhm.
No, they welcomed me, but they kind of did. But I had to be on
Okay, I'm going to go ahead and end the poll.
the COVES survey, so I can kind of watch that, work on my deck tomorrow, and
And I'm going to share some results. So it looks like for all of you can see the results right now, right? Cool. So how have you used the data? 30% of us report not having used it. That's fine. I know that there are many organizations on this call, some who are putting in the chat, like we just reopened, haven't had a chance to use it, or we've looked at others. But most of it has been for general reporting. So a few of us, 10 of 23, comparing over time. That's great. I know the Museum of Science has done this a little bit. Comparing to other organizations, that's a big one that we were interested in learning about as far as the, excuse me, the value of a core question. I'm happy to see that some people have been reporting externally. And then scanning the chat, it looks like there have been some suggestions. So Chris, you're welcome. I'm glad the data have been useful for the fleet. The tech print is saying additional cleaning that is, oh, for number 2. Okay, I'm jumping ahead. Okay, and then for number 2, what, if anything, is your museum currently doing to promote health and safety? So mask guidance for a lot of us, request or require. I know that this is very sticky depending on your location, but I'm glad to see that no one is saying nothing we didn't do pre-pandemic. So that means that all of our organizations are doing some kind of health and safety promotion, requirement, guidelines in response still to the pandemic that is worth taking into consideration when we think about measuring the visitor experience. So that's really what we are going to use that question and this information for. Elise is saying theoretically we require masks for people who aren't vaccinated, but we aren't asking people if they're vaccinated or not. So it's not really something that can be enforced. Same here. Yep. Huge gray area, big question marks for the visitors, depending on who they are. And Rachel's responding to that now. So, okay, I'm going to stop sharing this. But this has been really helpful. Thank you, everyone. And go ahead, Sarah.
Question, yeah. So for the almost half of us who said for general reporting over the year or whatever that option was, would anybody be willing to share what that has looked like? What sort of general reporting over the year might entail?
Well, I'll just say for us in St. Louis, I've been doing monthly reports to our senior team, just summarizing all the various data that's in COVES, sharing out the comments and trying to highlight different pieces as I present it. So it's just it's become sort of a monthly tracking tool in that sense.
Elisa, we're working really similarly. I produce a weekly report for our leadership team with a cross-functional group called Voice of Audience that COVES, all sorts of COVES data regularly folds into. And I would say we've been particularly focused on identifying or sharing visitors who identify that they feel safe on site, and then digging into those comments, that qualitative data, to make adjustments to stanchions in our lobby or signage or where the cafe tables are placed. Like, we've done some real tactical logistical adjustments based on that data pretty directly. And then at a kind of 30,000 feet senior leader level, have tracked general feelings of safety and preparedness, and how well we communicated what our policies and practices would be.
So I'll go back to this issue that Holly brought up before about visitors' comfort touching interactives. Now, I know not all of our museums are hands-on interactives. We've got art museums on the Skull, we've got natural history artifacts at different museums, but I'm wondering about that, particularly as the science more and more says this is airborne. And we've kind of come to accept that, except months ago, we had this conversation about hygiene theater and what we still needed to do for visitors, despite what the science shows. Because what we are interested in doing before even bringing it back to the questions and measures team at COVES is learning from you how valuable these different COVID related questions are in terms of the data you're using to inform our decisions. Because if it's useful for you, there's a couple things we can do. One, continue to leave them on there. That's the decision we temporarily made, at least until the beginning of July. Two, it could be a site-to-site flexible question thing. As you all know, core questions are designed to make comparisons across organizations simple and valuable. And if we start removing them from half of the surveys, then that comparison value really falls flat. So I'm interested in thinking for all of you, or continuing this conversation around the aspects of comparison that are essential or the ones you're using simply internally, whether it's for reporting, tracking to yourselves over time, knowing how contextual things are, or possibly tailoring some of these questions to your own site-specific needs by removing some of the core questions. So I want to open that up more fully about how you're using the data based on these questions and what you all would like to see happen on your own surveys. And I do acknowledge Rochester hasn't started using the data yet. We've got multiple representatives from NISI who are getting ready to open, Exploratorium getting ready to open, COSI just opened and getting ready to start collecting data. I know things are changing all over the country. I actually have no idea what's happening down in San Diego, Chris. I know this is kind of a moving target, but for those of you who want to weigh in, now's the time.
I know one of the things for us that we're interested in once we start getting data, because we are that mix of hands-on science and artifacts, right? So doing some comparative data in terms of why people are visiting or what their concerns are at other places will help drive us in terms of which side of our identity we're leaning into. Are we leaning into the hands-on, or are we leaning into the more hands-off in ways? Because we could emphasize either one, what's going to be better for us in terms of bringing back audience.
So we had a conversation about this with our senior team around some of the questions that we've been asking on our own, on an internal survey that we're doing that's similar to questions on COVES. And one thing that came up had to do with the touching exhibits question. And because, you know, as you mentioned, Ryan, you know, there's the whole hygiene theater thing, and we know COVID is not so much transmitted through touching. And so there was concern raised that question is sort of perpetuating that notion that we should be cleaning everything constantly because COVID is everywhere you touch, and we know it's not transmitted that way. So for our separate survey, we've actually we've taken off a question that was kind of similar to the touching question, and just sort of replaced that with a more generic, the Science Center was clean. So that we're asking about cleanliness in general, which we know is important, COVID or not, but not perpetuating that idea of that touching things is a high risk factor. We wanted to get away from that. So that's one that I think from our internal perspective, we wouldn't mind seeing that one go away.
I would be interested in how you changed it to a question that was generally about cleaning. I put in the comments or in the chat because cleaning is a topic that often popped up in the comments during the before times. We know cleaning is something that our visitors feel is important. And so some kind of question that opens up that topic seems like it might be useful. It's going to keep coming up in comments otherwise.
Well, I know we had previously on COVES, we've got, this wasn't part of what Alex put together for this, but we've got the series of questions on COVES on a 10-point scale about different aspects of the visit. There used to be an item on there specifically about restroom cleanliness that I know we took off when we started doing all the COVES changes. And so I'm wondering if that's a possibility to add back to that list a general, the institution was, the fill in the blank name of institution was clean or something to that effect. So that's not restroom specific, but it's still addressing that cleanliness question overall.
Yeah.
I was just,
oh, go ahead, Sarah.
I was just thinking about that too, of like, this is an interesting space perhaps between the restrooms are clean and the exhibits were in good working order. Like sort of a cross between them, which could be really useful.
Right. And when we would get comments about cleanliness, we always wondered if it was about exhibits looking old or if it was about things actually seeming unclean, and so I kind of liked it being tied to health and safety because that feels more critical to me, that things feel clean so that you feel safe from germs, regardless, if we're ideally talking about other germs aside from COVID, if we're talking about tactile. But yeah, some kind of question on that.
And I know Lauren at the Space Center Houston would love that because they actually have added that as a custom question as part of that. So we can engage in, we would love to support you all in making better use of those data, specifically if those types of transitions are necessary. So hear you loud and clear on the cleanliness. And to Elisa's point, there is a time, probably sooner than later, where we'll add that restroom cleanliness back in. We have also heard from 2 organizations where that's been critical for their understanding of the COVES data recently. But I'm gonna pick up the conversation to just ask about. We heard loud and clear that the comments have been useful, right? Rachel talked about it. I think Holly talked about it. There's a real good understanding. Now, a lot of the comments, open-ended comments, are coming from institutions using the email data collection method. Over time, right, we're going to switch back to in-person. That's a strategy for all of us, COVES at the national level, and I know your museums as we can get the capacity right. So I'm curious, Lisa, I know you're doing the staff data collection method. For those of you thinking forward to the staffed on-site method, how useful that series of questions about before arriving, to what extent did the museum address your concerns, followed by the open-ended ones, is going to continue to play a role in the short term in understanding our visitors' needs based on either the survey design or your data collection methods.
So I'm just going to kind of jump in because I'm kind of like Holly. It's one of those where the comments are more important at this point than the questions are, because we've, as an institution, kind of, due to external forces, we've had to drop, a lot of our policies that we had in place and kind of, modify what we could and drop what we had to. And so it's one of those, like, for us, I kind of was comparing data earlier about, when we had our closure and then as we started to reopen and seeing like there really wasn't a change in either way that it got reported. So for us, the questions are kind of becoming less important.
Kaylin or anyone else, do you feel like if the questions are less important and the comments are essential, that the field at the end of the survey, is there anything else you would like to add? Or perhaps just replacing one or more questions with kind of a please comment or please tell us more about the health and safety measures? Is there a replacement option, or is it kind of necessary to have the strategy we currently have? You know, how did you feel before visiting? To what extent did the museum address these concerns? Please tell us more. You know, if you're not relying on the closed-ended data, the numerical ratings. Said another way, can we replace what's on there with just a generic text box field?
That's kind of what I was wondering, like, to the question of like, to what extent did the museum address your health and safety concerns, of like, you know, please tell us if we didn't address your concerns, or something of that nature. That's just my 2 cents.
I will chime in as someone who's been collecting this data in person. When you switch from email data collection to in-person data collection, expect those comments to dwindle. And those that do comment will be much briefer. You know, I'm doing an email thing as well that's separate from COVES. That's where I get my robust comments. So I get these comments. I present them grouped based on how they answer the closed-ended questions, so that there's some organization there without having to do an extra layer of coding. I think they're useful, but again, because we're not getting as many as much qualitative data on this, I don't think it's as it's not as useful for us. But I think that's because of the methodology of data collection that we're not getting as much qualitative.
Just curious, have you experimented with providing any kind of keyboard, Bluetooth or otherwise? I know that's kind of a...
Oh yeah, I've had a keyboard the entire time. iPad with a keyboard the whole time, and a chair. So yeah, optimum conditions, I suppose, for trying to solicit comments. But yeah, it's the exit survey, and it's a long survey, and all that stuff factors in, as we all know.
I'm curious, so something that we're noticing in our open-ended is just kind of common things that are concerns. So I'm not sure if that's kind of consistent across organizations, but maybe it could turn into something that's more of a kind of checkbox. Like, did you have any concerns with these 5 things that are common? Maybe just kind of moving to a slightly more already coded version.
Things like, you know, difficulty with social distancing, sanitizing, mask wearing, et cetera, et cetera.
Other people mask wearing.
Yep, right.
Yeah, I would be, when people are talking about the open-ended questions too, I would be interested in also getting data of people that, we have a lot of people that do not want to wear masks and we still require it. And I think it would be interesting, like I know Chris just posted in the comments, like keeping the open question about how you felt about the museum's efforts to promote health and safety, because I think something like that would allow for both then the folks that maybe said, I do feel safe, thank you very much, and also the folks that are like, I think you're overdoing it, you know, because of this, this, and this. And it'd be nice to have both of that feedback.
All right, well, I'm eager to continue this conversation, but I'm also interested in hearing your thoughts on some of our reporting ideas or just sharing data more broadly. So an additional minute or 2 of final comments or questions or thoughts related to COVID specific questions and or potential instrument changes.
I'm getting the sense from this that though people still think that even though maybe we're doing a little bit less, a lot less to specifically promote health and safety in terms of policies and requirements, that learning about what people are feeling and perceiving about that still has value right now, because that's sort of the general sense I'm getting from everybody.
Yeah, and part of the tension I'm feeling is when, Karen, to your most recent comment, specifically about mask wearing, because I'm sure all of us are dealing with this in one way or another. Can we use that information to actually enact change? Or has that ship sailed, right? Like whether it's the state guidance or the museum's decision to kind of walk the other direction, how can we use that information to really change the way the experience is at the museum if we can't make sweeping changes for policy at our organizations? I'm thinking specifically about one really rich comment that the Museum of Science got about mask wearing and a 12-year-old daughter, and how can you say masks, what Elisa said earlier, how can you say masks are required for people who are unvaccinated if you haven't checked my vaccination status? Rings very true in my ears, and I yet we can't change that. I can't do that. I don't know what to do. So just acknowledging that there's a tension, and I think we're all going to be living in that space for the next couple months until, well, I don't know, until what? Until that's over with, until we're not. Okay, too much talking, so more time for you. So we're gonna switch gears a little bit. Thank you all for these comments and feedbacks. We are gonna save this chat and we're gonna bring it to the questions and measures team and continue to think about how we can retool the instrument to adapt as all of our organizations move forward. So the second topic we have for today's community of practice call is specifically around sharing our data, using our data, I would say reporting, but I think reporting is a very loose term this year in terms of what we can do with what we have. So we're going to try a second engagement strategy, which is new to our COP calls, and it's called a chatterfall. Some of you may be familiar with it. For those of you who aren't, let me tell you briefly. I'm going to pose a question. It's not a secretive question. It's the one from Alex's email. And rather than asking for people to say something out loud or to chat directly, I'm going to have everyone, or as many of you who would like to participate, take 30 seconds to think about the question and 30 seconds to actually write in your response in the chat box. And then when I tell you the time is up, I would like you all to press enter or submit your response so it can all pour in kind of like a waterfall in the chat feature. And it's not designed for us to respond directly to all of your comments, but it's so everyone can kind of just get their thoughts down. We can save it and pick a few of them for those of you who would like to expand on your ideas for the conversation. Any questions about the chatterfall? Okay, so I'm going to give you about 30 seconds to think and 30 seconds to type. So I'll be counting 60 seconds roughly. And the question to you is, how should we use our data, COVES data, to tell the story of this past year? Thank you, Sarah. All right, so about 60 seconds to think and type. All right, about 10 more seconds, and then we'll hit enter. Okay, go ahead and wrap up. And if you're done, just press enter and hopefully those chats will just pour in. Awesome. Whew. I love it. All right, I'm gonna pick on Jim because he was the first one to respond. But I'd love to hear more about your report to leadership on how attitudes have changed over time, if you're willing to expand on that.
Sure, it's pretty brief. And I just went kind of the beginning period after our reopening. So I did like mid-September through the end of October. And then I did the last 30 days. And we have more visitors right now. So there was a lot more responses in the last 30 days. And, you know, I mean, it was kind of what you would expect. People were generally more concerned in that earlier time period and less concerned now. So, but it was cool to see that reflected in the actual data. So not rocket science.
No, but documenting those changes is important.
Yeah.
I'm gonna keep this going. I'm now gonna pick on the second comment that came in, but by pick on, I mean really pull apart, because Joe, you mentioned track the changes in responses with the dominant messages coming from the health experts and political voices. And before I give you the opportunity to chime in, if you're willing, one of the things that we've been really interested in from a reporting perspective is, can we align any of our data with changes in public policy or the big crises, or kind of the just the ebbs and flows over the last year? Can we document these in a meaningful way and then look at our data in relation to it? And so I'm wondering if you can just say something.
That is exactly what I was thinking. Is it possible to see, were the visitors to science centers and other places more or less following the patterns in society, or were they leading edge?
And one of the things that we have been struggling as we think about that idea is how geographically dependent some of those things may be. So the CDC guidance at the national level is one thing, but as we're all experiencing right now, state regulations or requirements are another. I'm wondering if you or anyone has thoughts on ways we might align our data or how valuable that might be. I'll take stunned silence for you think it's hard, just like we think it's hard.
I think Joe's typing.
With still limited learning, one of the things I think is interesting is, you know, you've got some states with less restrictions, and so I'm assuming museums were open earlier, but yet we're all hearing the same national stories pretty much and national messages. So I'm curious, you know, even within those kind of local requirement differences, if there's still a story to be heard in terms of correlating with those national messages.
Yeah, and for an aggregate report, it would be interesting just to see, if you were to break it out regionally, if the results are different or if they're the same, knowing that some of us don't have data. So it's also hard.
A big concern is the role of institutions, museums in society, and what is the social obligation of those institutions. And this would be valuable information for that purpose.
So I'm looking at some of the questions we had around this idea, because we're gonna kind of pull from your chat, but directly related to this idea, I think we have a question collectively, and for you, what questions about the visitor experience remain unanswered? Meaning, maybe what has COVES not done for us in terms of thinking about the visitor experience, or what else can we dig a little deeper into to try and answer that question? Because we've all seen guidance change. We've all used the data in some way, it looked like, for reporting if we've been open. And I'm curious about the questions that we still have that we can't answer. And stunned silence here just means we can answer every question we've ever had.
One of the things that we were thinking about was sort of trying to capture what are all the questions that came up, what are the sort of crisis points and major concerns that arose over time, and is that a piece of what we track as well in terms of telling the story of the year? And so thinking about what still sits on our shoulders as we think about being some of the holders and interpreters of the data. What are still some of those questions from across your museum?
One of the things that for us at NISI, and I'm kind of new to all of this, that we are have been concerned with over the years is like the customer or visitor journey and the flow throughout the museum. And I don't know if COVES has covered that as much. How does the visitor use the museum? How do they interpret what is the best way for them to navigate throughout? And are there any kind of bottlenecks or roadblocks throughout that journey that prevent them from having the best experience they could have on that day? Something that we've always been concerned with.
I think there are some questions that some institutions have been utilizing, as institution specific questions that more of us are interested in, or that I know the fleet is interested in, but at the same time have that fear of adding too many questions, or like the crowding one comes to mind for me. That was a topic that other institutions, the information from theirs was very beneficial for us to think about, is how that impacts the visitor experience, but it's not a question we currently ask.
I think another area that would be helpful, although I don't know exactly how to compare this, would be, for example, like I know a lot of institutions have like very specific things like theaters or planetariums. It would be really nice to compare against like what our usage is. I don't think that's in the aggregate data right now, because I think those are specific to institutions, I guess. But like, as we think at NISI, we're reopening in July, as we think about reopening and we're trying to think of what protocols do we use 2D movies or 3D movies? What are institutions doing? It would be helpful to have that data.
So that's the direction I see some of these comments going, specifically with Shamila's most recent one about like venues and the things that we're doing. But I'm curious if there are ideas about what others at your organization, possibly not involved in COVES, are seeking to know. And I think we always bring that to the table when we have these types of conversations, especially if COVES has been up and running for a while at your museum. But now more than ever, what are you hearing in your own museum conversations where COVES aggregate data or this COVID responsive data could shed any light? Have you heard any other types of organizational questions come up that COVES could be helpful for?
Not COVID related, but we've been very interested in the degree to which we're seen as welcoming and relevant. And I think that would be interesting to see across museums.
Welcoming, big topic of conversation among the art museums that we convened a couple months ago.
And relevant for me is tricky, because I understand when you say it, it's like, yes, I want to know that too. But relevant to what or for what?
We actually dove into that in more detail on our, like we did the Wilkening survey of museum goers. And that was one of our custom questions, and we also altered it. So we dug in pretty deeply with what does relevant mean in our context. But that's definitely one that we would like to see from our actual visitors rather than just our mailing list. So
would you be willing to share a sentence or two about what you learned? Just like, what does relevant mean to those who were surveyed?
I don't remember, but I do have it up, so I'll look.
Sure.
And I don't think we would have probably a standard definition of it where we are when we say relevant, we're relevant to that particular person and their life experience. And we're particularly interested in looking at that across demographic groups to see if that's varying. And we have that, I think at least welcoming, we might have the relevant question, and we're not at a high enough number of surveys yet to be able to say anything conclusive, but from what we have, it does appear there are differences in the degree or the percentage of people.
Okay, I have it up. So the things that we defined as potentially being relevant are, and this is kind of in order of descending relevance for us, but it makes programs and exhibits that are kind of related to topics they're already interested in, surprises them with unexpected connections, tells meaningful stories, makes them interested in topics that they didn't consider before, age appropriate for children, reflects current challenges, beliefs, and cultures, teaches something that they can use in everyday life, or I don't know, or none of these. So that's what we currently had. Wasn't super well vetted, but it's a good starting place and kind of informative for us.
Yeah, it's a great starting place. I love that idea. And just to build off this idea of welcoming too, and we've said it before on these calls, but there is a grant that's being spearheaded by SMM to dig more deeply into this, which has been stymied by the pandemic in terms of data collection, with the hope that we could kind of boil what is potentially a long scale down into a single question or shorter scale for use on the COVES instrument. There are a few of us on this call and those not on the call who are asking a simple, did you feel welcome today type of question, which we could add on for others of you who are interested, even if we don't fully know the technical details, if you will, you know, how reliable or valid that is for assessing what we're truly thinking about when we have that conversation. But in light of no data, some data might be useful. So there's lots of directions we could go with this, but now we're already branching into like what data to use rather than what stories to tell. So the core team can reflect back on a lot of your suggestions. And just since we're getting closer to the bottom of the hour, I wanted to kind of resurface that big question and ask you all again, if you have any specific desires for sharing the data that you think haven't been mentioned out loud that you really want to reinforce at all.
Well, I just was going to throw out with respect to unanswered questions, the way I was thinking about that particular line of thinking is the questions that came up over the past 15 months during COVID, like, are people still visiting for the same reasons when they come back? When they come back, is the experience dominated by fear, or is it dominated by like happiness and excitement? Like, what were our ratings like? How did they change? Were members the first ones to come back, or was it varied across different sites? Those are the kinds of things that I'm wondering if you all are wondering about, because I'm wondering about them.
And then not a question specific topic, but a survey process, wondering about keeping the email version of questions versus going back to only doing in person.
Okay, well, I'm always sensitive to long periods of silence on virtual calls. I think in person, if you can kind of scan the room and everyone's quiet, you get a sense. But on virtual calls, I think we're always waiting, like, who's going to talk next? Is it our turn? Do we have to chat? What happens now? So I think,
Kaylin, were you going to share something? I saw you come off mute doing the signal of I'm going to say something.
Well, I was just gonna say for like Chris's question in terms of like the email versus like in person, like I know like for us, we're gonna stick with the email through the summer like option, partially because I'm on maternity leave and partially because you know, I think it's until we kind of get back to the fall and get back to everybody in school, everybody doing things that makes the most sense for us as the museum. But like something I'm looking forward to in the idea of the fall is like the idea of bringing back an in-person thing. And I really like the idea of a keyboard. I hadn't thought about that and I like that idea. And so I definitely am going to look into that. So.
And for those of you that haven't either pushed us or already enabled it, there's a QR feature, right? So we can produce a QR code for the same survey that will feed into your staffed method, right? Like you're queuing visitors, you're randomly sampling them at exit. Will you please help us out by filling out the survey? If you prefer to use your own device because you don't want to touch ours, or because you're going to fill it out while you're walking to the car, that's a great other option, and that might provide more detailed open-ended responses. Elise is shaking her head no, because she's been doing it for a year. But
it's
for
a good
others
option
of
to
us,
have. It's a great option to have. People appreciate having the option. The conversion of actually clicking the link and then filling out the survey, lousy.
and I would say
At
that
least for
that's,
us.
I think that's site dependent, right? So if at least it's worth
At
an
least for us.
experiment for those of you,
Yeah.
because it's not changing our methodology functionally enough where the responses will differ, like the email versus the onsite. And so that is a strategy we're going to consider going with for the long term. And it's also a good accessibility feature if visitors have accessibility software or devices on their phone, for example, that they can use. If it would be otherwise hard for them to use your iPad or tablet, it's a great accommodation. So neither here nor there really, except if you are not using that and you want to, please reach out and we'll provide that and make sure it's trackable. And thank you, Kaylin, for that kind of final summary comment about just, you know, different ideas, staying with the same method through the summer and then making some changes as potentially visitors slow down again and school resumes in whatever format school will resume, hopefully in person in a safe way for all of us. But just saying thank you to all of you for this input. We've got a much richer chat dialogue than usual. So again, we're going to save this. We've got the results from the poll. We're going to have some additional conversations on the COVES leadership side, particularly some of our subcommittees, to make some changes. And we will keep you all informed as always. But until then, have a wonderful summer. Good luck with everything, specifically for those of you who are gearing up for reopening, who have just reopened. We wish you nothing but the best, and hopefully COVES can be a great service for you, and especially this community. Don't forget to just message the community if you have questions. And otherwise, we will see you in July-August. Take care, everyone.
Bye, everyone. See ya.
Bye.